Hey everybody, it's Chase with AV Pop Culture again, and today I am here to talk about how and why almost everyone is evaluating 4K releases, 4K transfers, and 4K restorations incorrectly. And I'm going to do it from a filmmaker's point of view. So pop that tape in. I got you. Let's go do this. All right, so I know that that is coming in with what seems like a hot take, maybe, and I'm going to do my best to try to not come off sounding like a irritating asshole know-it-all here. But as I've gotten more back into collecting again and back into the community, I have just seen all of this. I have to look. You guys got me tore up this morning already. I had to get coffee. This one's been working on my nerves for a while. It's a whole thing. So as I've gotten more back into this, and I've seen so many great YouTubers videos, and this is no shot at anybody out there. Everybody doesn't have the same background, same experience, and we draw from our experiences, right? In our education. So for me, like going back to the late 90s, I learned how to cut on film, shoot on film, and develop, movie film. I don't like to do it because it's a pain in the ass. And I haven't done it in years. And I grew up at a time when everything was delivered to you in an analog format, and that's going to play an important role in what I'm about to talk about. So being a kid in the 80s, early 80s, going to the movies, and then getting VHS, all of that stuff, because 35 millimeter film, as beautiful as it is still an analog technology. And it was delivered to you through other analog technology and then early digital. So you went to the movie theater, you saw the movie on a reel to reel. Then you got a VHS. It's also a reel to reel tape. And then early DVDs are more close to analog quality. Just basically like a VHS put onto a disc. So a lot of the stuff, that's where we're going to start. A lot of the stuff that is being reviewed from an improper mindset of today and right now and a digital thought process. We can't do that. So as I said, 35 millimeter film is analog. In order to do these 4K restorations, yes, the best ones are going back to the 35 millimeter, negative of the film, but that is taking a old, in most cases, analog piece of technology, that film, and then scanning it with a digital upgrade to 4K. Now, 35 millimeter film carries a shit ton of information. Like in theory, it carries up to like 12K clarity of data, right? It blows away anything we have in the digital camera market now. But it is aging, and it was captured still in an analog way. And when you scan that, when you take analog and you scan it and you move it to digital, it doesn't automatically get rid of any imperfections. If you call things like grain and stuff imperfections, it's not necessarily going to get rid of those. It's going to heighten those. You're going to see those things more because it's giving you a clearer picture. So what happened then? So like what happens is when these filmmakers shot this stuff on 35 millimeter film, they knew it was going to be delivered basically kind of the same way they shot it on film strip, reel to reel, and then later VHS. And so a lot of these things that everybody is so focused on, oh, grain fluctuations. We're going to get into to why grain fluctuates here in just a second. And it doesn't have shit all to do with the 4K remaster in most cases. So they didn't worry about these grain fluctuations or what have you, because when you shot on 35 millimeter and then you delivered it on an analog projector or VHS, it was going to soften that grain. It was all going to look completely natural, filmic. You weren't going to see any fluctuations because you didn't have these massive like 4K digital super clarity delivery methods and watching methods like our TVs and stuff like that today. You didn't have that. So it was never going to be seen. So you're kind of doing a little bit of revisionist history when you go back and you 4K scan a movie and then bitch about the grain. Well, that grain wasn't seen the same way upon initial release. And of course, you're improving the image there. That means it's bringing everything in the image up, including the grain. So then you say, oh yeah, but well, that doesn't make sense. The grain fluctuates from scene to scene and it takes me out of this 4K release. I heard, and again, I'm not calling anyone out, but I saw a review of Crybaby recently, and someone, and a couple of people, not just one, have said, oh, well, there is almost like flashing of grain in the background in some of these places where it's dark, or it's like in the bushes, or things like that. You know why? Because that all was predicated in large part on lighting at the time that it was done, at the time the film was shot. So you're not dealing with the same kind of they didn't plan the same kind of dynamic range delivery that we have right now. So maybe the background wasn't lit as much, and in the foreground was lit more, and so they adjusted their shutter, their ISO, their lighting, everything was in this mix was adjusted to get the foreground subject. They did not give a shit about what was way in the background in the bushes, right? They cared about what you were seeing, the subject, the main subject, because when they delivered the film, that background was going to just kind of roll away. As it should, because that's how our eyes work. That's the other thing. That's how our eyes work. Our eyes, go look in the distance. As things get far away, they roll off in clarity, right? That's how films were shot, with the intention of it rolling off in clarity to the background. So no, maybe something in the very background, back left corner in the bushes, in the dark parts in the bushes. No, it's probably not going to look the same. But is that going to, am I up to my TV, like looking like, hey man, in the back there, there's some shit messed up. Like, who's doing that? And don't blame the transfer, and don't blame the filmmaker, because you have, this movie was made in 1990, which means it was, or it came out in 1990, which means it was shot in probably 1989, maybe starting in late 88 into 89. And then they had to edit it, and they cut it, you know, and all of that kind of stuff. It was shot on film, obviously. It was different. Like they weren't thinking 35 years later, someone is going to go and blow up and clarify every imperfection that might be in this film. And that's what's happening. So you take, when you do a 4K, you increase the good and you increase the bad. And it's not just how it's lit plays a lot. I'll hear people, whether it's Crybaby or True Lies, and we're going to get to that, or Weird Science, which I actually think is a perfect 4K. and it has nothing to do with how much I love the movie, and we're going to get to it. When I hear people say, oh, well, there's fluctuation in grains from this scene to this scene, there's more grain in this scene and there's less grain in this scene. So did they DNR it, and then they're making it uneven? Well, in some cases, maybe they did use DNR, and that's a whole other subject we're going to get to in a minute. But with grain, of course, it's going to fluctuate from scene to scene because every scene is not lit the same way, right? Grain is inherent in the film. And when the more light that is exposed to grain, the less noticeable the grain is going to be. But when there is less light, then the camera is almost searching for light. And the grain in that film becomes more noticeable because there's less light to give it information to overcome that grain, right? So the camera sees less, the lens sees less, so the film records less, and the grain fills in those gaps, right? So darker scenes often tend to be more grainy because there's less light. And so when I hear people, oh, well, it fluctuated from this scene to this scene. No shit, because everything wasn't lit flat. Like in the same thing with the background of the crybaby scene or any background. You want depth of field. You want depth in lighting. I mean, not to try to toot my own horn, but just so you guys know where I'm coming from. Like I said, I have been editing and filming for a long time, and I've been nominated or won awards at festivals all over the place. I've been hired to edit other people's stuff, color treat, which is another factor, and all of that kind of stuff for 2 decades now. And it's a different thought process. Like I'm sitting there and I'm like, well, yeah, the lighting changed. You want depth in lighting. So if you look behind me here, I have the neon sign. So I went, because I love that 80s like retro neon video rental store movie marquee type vibe. So I went with a lighting scheme that did that, but to create levels and depth. You see my shelf lighting back here, right? The purposeful reflection on the other, because every movie you saw at nighttime that had a neon in the 80s had beautiful neon reflections. So that's there, and it bounces more light. Then you have this that kind of matches it, that throws a little bit of light on my face. You have levels, and then over here to the side, I'm going to turn it off so it doesn't blind you. I have this, see how it got darker? I have this little light, right? Woo! And it will cast a little bit of extra just light so that it looks like that neon light, the blue in it or the pink, whatever color I do, is reflecting, right? You create levels of light and depth of field. So they probably, in some of those cases, wanted the scene to get darker and lighter. And so when you, especially as it fell away to the background, so you want that depth and that color and light variation because it gives depth to the scene. And it makes the foreground, it makes your subject pop more. Instead of producing a very flat image. They could do away with all grain if they completely flat lit someone from the front and the back evenly, right? There's no side light, there's no angle light. If they lit them completely even, front and back, it would be flat, and you wouldn't have your grain, and you wouldn't have your need for DNR, you wouldn't have any waxiness, but it would look like shit. And you would be like, why does this look funny? You won't even, it's one of those things you won't notice, but you'll be like, why did that look funny? And it's because there's no depth. There's no levels in the lighting. But those levels can cause more grain, because up here Where it's really lit, less grain. In the background, where it gets darker and fades away, more grain. So that is a natural occurrence. And then we get into, and that's baked in. There's nothing they can do about it besides overly DNR and smooth it. And then people are going to complain about that too. So there's no sort of win there. I prefer the grain. Grain is natural. Grain behaves, makes the textures in the film behave more about like our eyes see. So that's why when you take all the grain away, people are like, that they look like wax. Yes, because that's not how you see. Digital cameras are not how we see. We don't see in all focus, in all fields, in hard lines. That's not how we see. Things roll off in our vision. They roll off to the peripheral. They roll off to the background and to the distance. They roll off. Filmic roll off is more realistic than digital, where everything is in focus at every level and looks waxy and fake. So you're going to have one or the other. I prefer the grain. And then there's other factors to take into account. Like, yes, we all hear, well, it's got a 35 millimeter negative, and that's going to be an awesome, print and all that kind of stuff. Yes, it is. But a lot of the films that are being done that we remember were not shot on 35 millimeter full frame cameras. They were shot on Super 35, right? So Super 35, what it does is it kind of like stretches the image this way and squeezes it this way. So that they could use non-anamorphic lenses, so that they could use spherical lenses and put cameras in places they couldn't get them before. They came up with the idea of Super 35. And what it does is take up the space on the film where the analog audio, like safety tracks, would be. So now it's a completely silent video, right? Or film. And it's going to take it and squeeze it out this way and stretch it out this way. So what happens when you start squeezing and stretching, you can get more grain because you're changing you're kind of cropping in a little bit. And anytime, look, even take your digital camera, for instance, right now, take the digital camera on your phone and zoom all the way in. The farther you zoom in, the more grainy and distorted that picture gets, and it's digital. It's the same concept here. So, and Super 35 was the rage. Like, I wrote down most of the films that you see, and Cameron shot almost exclusively on Super 35. So The Abyss, T2, True Lies, Titanic, Point Break, all those shot on Super 35. Okay. Tony Scott, big user of Super 35. Beverly Hills Cop 2, Top Gun, Man on Fire, Deja Vu, Super 35. Ridley Scott, Gladiator, Super 35. Spielberg, Super 35. Most all of his stuff. Sam Raimi, Peter Berg, Ron Howard, Apollo 13, Super 35, right? John Hughes, Super 35 and like an Ultracam mix. David Fincher, Seven, Fight Club, Super 35, right? So a lot of the stuff that we remember, like these big movies from the 80s and 90s, shot on Super 35, not full frame. So it's all kind of punched in just a little bit, right? And to show you what I mean, I pulled these pictures here. Hopefully I can get them up. You'll kind of see the difference here between this is the exact same the exact same lens. One's on a 35 millimeter full frame. One is on a 35 millimeter super 35 millimeter camera, and they're both set with the exact same lens, the exact same focal range, focal distance, all that kind of stuff. And you're going to see how much difference there is in the amount of image that's captured and how much is punched in. You can see here that the Super 35 is punched in. You see less image and it brings it forward, and that can create a little bit more grain, right? And change the image. Whereas the full frame back there, it captures more image, right? And then if you've got an anamorphic, it's going to widen that out even more. So you've got a lot more area to stretch that out. And so then the grain is not punched in forward and squished down and becomes less noticeable, right? So it's going to be less noticeable on a full frame. That's just part of it. Then you get a film. First let me show you. Like, this is my Super 35 millimeter. Now, this is a digital cinema camera. This is a Canon Cinema line, and this is with an anamorphic lens on it. This is my son in my street as sort of a subject. And you can kind of see where I just did some low light tests and some cloudy daylight tests back in the fall, which is my favorite time to shoot. And my son here is just, he only has the street light above and the street light in the very back to light him. We took no other light out there, and you'll see the raw images from the camera. Then you'll see where I kind of color corrected, and then you'll see where I did a little bit of noise reduction on them using like Neat Video. Did some noise reduction, and you can see the difference. And it's a preferential thing, but to me, when you start to, even in these images, when you start to use the digital noise reduction, it starts to look odd a little bit. But I'll tell you why James Cameron is probably doing that. And we'll start talking about that here now with True Lies. So people have shit on this so much. We had nothing but a DVD forever. I'm happy to have the 4K. Let me tell you part of the reason why I think James Cameron is doing a lot of DNR. First of all, before we jump into that, just something that's real quick. The color grading on all this stuff is something that is completely different. So when you see a 4K restoration and the color is changed, that doesn't have shit all to do with the actual 4K restoration itself. The restoration is not changing the colors. They're regrading the color. And that can be a perfect personal preference, whether you want things to look a cooler tone, a warmer tone, richer, redder skin tones, or more of a grayed out skin tone. That's all subjective. So that is kind of separate. So if you saw skin tones, that's all has to do with the colorist. And I've spent a lot of times coloring, and man, you can fall in love with it multiple ways. Like, oh God, it looks so good this way, looks so good this way, looks so good that way. In the end, you just have to pick something because the color is subjective. So don't let that distract you. That is something that's done deliberately, the color grading. All right. So back to why I think James Cameron is doing so much digital cleanup on these. Cameron has always wanted to be like ahead of his time and like on the cutting edge. He's always wanted his movies to bypass being dated. He's kind of been a prisoner of the technology of his time, and he wanted to like future-proof them, which is very hard to do. Now, discounting a mistake that was made with what version they did a 4K restoration of for Terminator 2, that's just kind of a blunder. This film jumped straight from DVD to, not counting a Spanish or bootleg release, straight from DVD to 4K. And yes, there's some scenes where the DNR is overly done, most likely, but I'm going to tell you why it comes out that way and why I think he's doing that. I've seen equally as many comments bitching that they hate people bitching that they hate film grain, right? So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. I would dare say most people under the age of 35, they have grown up seeing films that are more familiar with films that are shot digitally, right? And definitely if you're under 30. You're used to that, because if you're 30, you were born in like 95, and by the time you really started paying attention to movies around 2001 or 2000, the digital switchover in filming had already begun. So most of your like really remember years from like 10 through your teens and stuff, you've grown up with more digital. And the digital has that, what I consider an artificial sharp image that our eyes don't see. But that's what you're used to, that super clean, super digital image that to me isn't realistic. And it cracks me up, because when I got into filmmaking as a digital filmmaker years ago, every filmmaker I knew was trying to find a way to take the digital image they recorded and make it look more like film with film stock, digital film stock overlays, all kinds of stuff. They were trying to make it look more like it was shot on film, because digital isn't natural to our eyes. But when you get used to something and stuff is shot digitally, delivered digitally, and everything else, when you go back and you see something that has actual film grain in it, you can be like, why is it so grainy? Why is it so grainy? If you grew up with rabbit ears on your TV and you grew up going to see, Ghostbusters in the theater or True Lies in the theater, grain is natural. Grain is like, for the purist, for people who really love film, in my opinion, it's like the difference between a digital download of a song and listening to it on a vinyl record. And there's a reason why vinyl's coming back, because the perfectly perfect imperfections, the clicks and pops and white noise, or in this case, the grain and stuff like that, they add to the depth of the filmic experience. So even the people who grew up on digital, when you take too much of that out, it becomes weird feeling. Not only does it become weird feeling, you begin to lose dynamic range and detail, because literally the devil is in the details. And in this case, some of those details are in the grain. And when you over smooth them away, you start to lose that. But I think Cameron is doing it to deliver it to a new audience who grew up on digital. And then the other fluctuations are just simply where he can't get it out. Like if his scene was darker, if it was underexposed just slightly, or shot at night just in general, you're not going to be able to get rid of all that. Now, if you're outside in the day, which oddly enough, a lot of these scenes that are most complained about being waxy are outside during the day, he had an abundance of light. So there wasn't very much grain there anyway. So if he runs the same level of DNR on it that he does on the grainy scenes, it's going to over smooth and over like desaturate of grain those scenes. Because if you had 10%, I'm just picking something. If you had 10% digital noise removal here on this night scene, and it just went through to the day scene is going to look overly smoothed out at the same percentage removal, right? Because the day scene had an abundance of light. They were probably having a block light out. It had an abundance of light, so it didn't have that much grain in it anyway compared to the night scene. But I think it's being done on purpose to deliver it to generations of people who grew up on digital. Because when you go and you look, those who don't like the grain are usually younger. Oh, I like the crisp look. That's not really how people look. And fuck it. I don't like that. Give me some grain. Another thing that I've heard about, and I'm going to put this video up on screen right now, and it's probably not going to look good because I just grabbed I film with a little DJI Pocket 3 that shoots in 4K. That's what I film these videos with. I carry it with me when I film out in the public and theme parks and stuff too. Beautiful camera, shoots like 10-bit depth. It'll shoot raw 4K, which just blows my mind. But I filmed my TV with Weird Science on because there's a lot of talk about some of the scenes in here, particularly the opening scene. And I'm going to tell you what I think partly is responsible for some of the extreme grain in the opening scene, because I consider this an amazing 4K. The opening scene and some of the other scenes, like scenes in the bar, when Lisa takes them and they're drinking, and this isn't just for this film, it's for other films, but you can see it in this film. They are more grain. They have way more grain than other scenes in the film. And if you look really close, like Michael Anthony Hall on the opening sequence when the camera pans up, or when they're in the bar, his skin tones are slightly different. Now, did they change the color grade for that? No. Let me tell you what I think actually happened, and it's just being pulled out in films like this, in these scenes and others. This film was finished photochemically, right? So it was chemically developed. And you can literally leave a film in the solution too long, and it's called, pushing the negative, right? And it starts to overexpose it if you leave it in there too long. And it can start to redden the colors, and it can cause way more film grain. So you're basically you're starting to overexpose it, so it loses color fidelity and increases grain. And it's called pushing the negative. And I wanted to make sure that I remembered to talk about this with you guys, because I think that happens in a lot of scenes in films that were shot on film and then literally developed old school style with chemicals during that process. All you got to do is leave it in there just slightly longer than you did the next scene to it, or the next shot to it, and it can cause variance. That has nothing to do with the 4K restoration. The 4K restoration is just bringing out what is there. So it was already there when it was delivered to you in an analog format on VHS or even an old DVD or in the movie theater. You didn't notice it, because those things softened the variances, right? And then you take something that was developed photochemically and you let it sit for 40 years, 40 fucking years, right? And those things can be enhanced. The imperfections can get worse over time. And then when you scan it 4K digitally, you're taking this old analog photochemical developed film that's been sitting degrading for 40 years, and you're taking it and you are scanning it with a new digital technology that is increasing the clarity to the best that it can be. In most cases, technically it could probably go higher than 4K, but you can't see it any higher than 4K. But what that would do is also bring up the imperfections, right? So when I hear the grain isn't stable from scene to scene, fuck no, the grain isn't stable, because the scenes are not all lit the same. The film might not have been processed the exact same. It could have had variances in their lighting, all of that. It changes the film grain in a natural way, but you are seeing it more noticeably because of the way it is being delivered to you. And right along with the great stuff in the film, any imperfections are also being brought up. Now, your option is to go back and digitally remove those with DNR. But if they do that, you're going to bitch about it too. So there is no way to make everyone happy on these. The way I look at it, changing the color grade bothers me more than anything. Now, it can be done well, and I love it. I brought this up in another video, our 4K restorations ruining old films. I used Red Dawn as an example. I'm going to get into that. I watched Red Dawn, freaking loved the grade. Freaking loved it, all right? But it is not the original color grade. All right, they changed it. This film, I don't actually think they changed a whole lot. They could have maybe tried with the color grain in the opening scene to smooth out the skin tones, but that's why I don't think they changed a whole lot. They just brought up what was there. I like that. And I kind of wish the releases would start having the original release unchanged to go with the 4K. I think that would be cool. So you have like the side by side and no, but I like the film grain. I believe it is pure to filmmaking. I believe that it is more realistic to what our eyes see. And you have to understand that it is going to, a lot of cases, vary from scene to scene, because from scene to scene, lighting changes. From scene to scene, the lenses change. You are going to get more, and the cameras are different on film, on different films. You're going to get film grain variances from full frame 35 millimeter cameras to a super 35 millimeter camera. You're going to get film grain variants from a spherical lens to an anamorphic lens. And the anamorphic lens you should always be able to spot because it's going to have those long, light trails off of lens flares, off of lights, right? And spherical is going to be different. It's not going to have those long, it's going to have more like a halo bokeh, right? So but the lenses themselves, if you've got an old lens, maybe the lens had a little bit of fungus in it. Like, there are tons of variables, but the biggest variable is going to be the camera, the film processing, and simply the lighting in the scene. The lighting, the different lighting from scene to scene is going to change the grain. And then if they take out too much grain with DNR, a lot of people aren't going to be happy with that either. So you got to pick what your battles are. And, you know, I think James Cameron's doing it to stay up to date. I think he's trying to do that. And I think the reason there are variances is because a lot of True Lies is shot at night. A lot of it's outside. And a lot of the scenes people are complaining about the most looking waxy are outside. They had an overabundance of light. There was already very little grain. So if the same amount of grain removal DNR was applied to that very well lit scene as the dark scene, the very well lit scene's going to lose detail, going to look smooth and slightly waxy. That is a byproduct of trying to even out the grain throughout the scene or throughout the movie and deliver it to people who grew up on digital. In my opinion, that's what he's doing. People who grew up on digital in order to stay at the forefront and make it look like it was just now shot recently. That's a bad byproduct of it. I would have just left the grain. But James Cameron can do what he wants to. He's fucking James Cameron. All right? He can do what he wants to. And you don't have to agree with it, but the a lot of the valuations, bitrate is bullshit to an extent, because bitrate, if you have a scene that is full of grain because it was underexposed, then when they do a 4K restoration and they lift it all up, it could be at 100 bits per second. And guess what? You're going to see more. You're going to have all bitrate is the amount of video data in there at the moment that it's reading it. Right. And there is no fancy equipment that you need to test that. I could hook stuff to my computer, rip it off, do a test. But most of your great 4K players, you'll be able to hit display and see what the playback bitrate is on that. And it will give you at least some kind of idea. It's not like rocket science, but so it's more data in that given moment. If there's a shit ton of grain in there at that given moment, then that means it just captured more grain, right? And if it's overly smooth at that moment, it captured more overly smoothing, right? So bitrate is a big bunch of BS in my opinion. It does mean that you got a lot of information on that disc, but whether it's carrying through to playback, so it's got a lot more information. Great. It could have a lot more grain information or DNR information in it and just deliver more of it to you. Okay. So, I mean, I know that this is kind of a rant here and I come off as sounding like an arrogant know-it-all, but when you, I don't know, when you've made films for a long time and you love films and everything and you just kind of hear and see it, it's kind of like, let me see if I can kind of steer you back and give you an example of why things may be this way, and maybe you'll look at them in a different way and not just like, this is not a good 4K transfer, or the grain fluctuated so it sucked. Well, but this is why it had, like, just trying to give you some different perspective on it. You can tell me I'm crazy. Maybe I got something wrong in here. It happens sometimes when I go on a rant. But I really wanted to give you a different perspective from the other side of the camera and from someone who is also a lifelong fan and a physical media lover and collector and things like that, who's also, a filmmaker and been doing that a long time. So everybody has different experiences. You guys let me know what you think in the comments, and maybe this gave you a new perspective and a new way to think about it when you watch films before you rush to find all of the imperfections. Coming from someone who makes an indie films, I have gotten used to what happens is when critics and fans watch lower budget independent films, unfortunately, a lot of times they watch them to find everything that's wrong, right? Because they know that you had a lower budget, you had this and that. So unfortunately, they watch to see what's wrong instead of enjoying the film. If we just watch to see what we perceive as wrong and we don't have a foundation of why the things might be that way, then we're kind of missing a lot, and we may be unfairly judging something. So just a little something to think about, and I hope you've enjoyed this. Until next time, be kind, rewind like always. This is Chase with AV Pop Culture, and I'll see you real soon. Bye-bye.